All right, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin, if we can, please. Couple of things before we jump into it. I'm assuming everyone got their homework back. You guys can do math. It's just, nothing we didn't know. So, yeah, I have nothing much to add to the homework. Couple of 100%. Most people got in the high 90s. Move on. I am back on the island, but I'm just rushed here. I'm hot and I'm sweaty and I'm unshaven, so you guys are not going to see my face today. Sorry. We are most likely going to go a little bit longer today and Wednesday than we usually do. So we may go all the way up to 8:45, maybe even 9 o'clock. Just so you know, the idea is that we want to make up for the lost time. And given that's the case, I'm going to shift your midterm exam from this coming Wednesday to next Monday. That will give us time to cover some of the things that I want to make sure that we have a good handle on ahead of that exam on Monday. All right. I think that's it. Everyone should have handed in your homework number 4 by class today. Again, it's predominantly math, so I'm not terribly worried that you won't do well on it. Okay, so up to this point, we have been talking about the basic concepts of macroeconomics. Everything that we started off with some basic definitions, so we understood the language that we were talking about, and so that we can employ the language of economics in our conversations. Then we began laying out some of the basic concepts of macroeconomics. We talked about GDP, or economic output. We talked about employment, and we talked about inflation. Now what we want to begin, really, the rest of the semester is about putting those concepts to work. And we want to begin our conversation talking about how the economy operates in the long run. In the long run, in economics, the long run is defined as a period of time in which all of our inputs is flexible, right? Which means that, in essence, in the long run, we're operating on our production possibilities curve, on our PPC. Because in the long run, because we're saying there's no factor production that's fixed, we can reallocate our factor production to the areas to which they are most suitable, most efficient, most effective. So say, for example, you start talking about labor. In the long run, that means certainly all of everybody who we count as part of our labor force that we talked about in our last class, all of those persons between 18 and 65 are working. They're not just working, they're working full-time. They're not just working full-time, they're working in the positions that they're most suitable for, either by temperament, by education, by training, by experience. And not just that, they are working to the best of their ability. There's no slacking off, no slunking, nothing. Okay? And that's just talking about labor, and we apply that same rationale to all the other factors of production. So that's what we mean when we talk about the long run. We're talking about being on our PPC. But you also can realize just by that conversation right there is that this is not an achievable goal. It's an ideal. Right? Because if you think about labor, we're never going to get to that point where every single person in the labor force is working full-time, working in the area and the positions that are most suitable for them. But it's something to aim for. So when we extrapolate that to the economy as a whole, and we're saying the economy is on the PPC, and we don't think we're ever going to get there, but the idea of looking at the economy in the long run is that we know where we want to get to. We don't know if we'll ever get there, but if you don't know where you want to get to, you have no way of assessing where you are relative to that end goal. Right? And so when we're talking about our economy, our end goal is the economy operating at its most efficient on the PPC. But if we don't know what that point is, then we don't know how close or how far we are from getting there. So we first want to talk about how the economy looks when it's operating on the PPC. A very realistic perspective on how our economy operates in the long run. And that is what we call classical economics. Classical economics is all about how the economy is operating in the long run, and we will very clearly define what we mean by that in a moment. And that is contrasted with how the economy operates when we're away from our PPC, when we're away from what we call the short run. And it's what we call Keynesian economics, as in sugar cane, because it's named after the economist Keynes. I'm sorry. So he focuses attention. We will talk a lot more about John Maynard Keynes in a moment, but his focus was on what happens in an economy when it's away from the PPC, when it's away from equilibrium, when there is some unemployment in the economy, when GDP is negative, right? When you're in a recession, right? When you have inflation, when you have unemployment. What is the economy looking like, and how does the economy react, and how does the economy act to get back to full employment? So we're going to take a look at how the economy operates in the long run, classical economics, and how the economy operates in the short run, Keynesian economics, and how we get hopefully back to where we need to be. Right? Then we're going to look at the short run production function. The short run production function is exactly that. The economy operating in the short run. What are the factors? What are the rationale? What's happening in the capital market in the short run? What's happening in the labor market in the short run? What does this have to do with macroeconomic policy? Is there room for policy? Right. And we're going to talk about whether we're talking fiscal policy or monetary policy. And then even on the fiscal side, we're going to talk about, in this case, a very specific example called supply side fiscal policy and the Laffer curve. Now, once we begin to have some sort of understanding of how the economy operates in the short and the long run, our next issue is going to be, why does the economy actually grow? It seems counterintuitive. I mean, it grows or it doesn't grow, but why? What are the factors that cause an economy to grow? Because once we understand the factors that may cause an economy to grow, then from policy perspective, we start thinking about what kind of policies we need to put in place that can address these issues that we know are going to lead to economic growth, or what is causing our economy not to grow the way it's supposed to grow. So once we understand what causes an economy to grow, then we can begin thinking and planning policies that's going to address those issues. All right, so let's start from the beginning. Definitions. Right? Classic economists or long-run economists, right, assume that there are strong forces in the economy that will continually push the economy towards equilibrium. Right? And one good example would be employment. Right? So let's say there's an economic shock. Right? And that economic shock, let's say the 2008 financial crisis, or 9/11, some fools flying some planes in some buildings in New York. Right? But the result is that there's an economic shock, or a hurricane will work just as well, any economic shock. And let's say that economic shock has led to some people getting laid off at the hotels, right? Which is not an unusual occurrence in the Bahamas. I mean, it's one that we can easily identify with. Right? There's an economic shock, tourists stop coming, hotel closed down, some tower or some wing or something, so they need less workers. People got laid off from the hotel. Now, classical economists or the long-run economists are saying, listen, individuals have every incentive to return to the workforce as soon as possible. All right. Yes, you got laid off. Yes, that's a tragedy. Yes, you lose your job, but you still got bills. You still got kids to feed and clothe. You still got school fee to pay. You still got mortgage. You still got rent. You still got car payment. You still got BC, BPL, or everybody else. So what do? You can't just throw your hands up and then say, forget it. So classical economics says individuals have every incentive to return to the labor force as soon as possible. You're just looking for a job at this point. Right? Ideally, you would like to go back to where you was, but the fact of the matter is you just need a job. You need some money. Right? And if that means you're accepting a job that's paying you less than what you was making, listen, a small job is better than no job. So classical economics says, listen, individuals have every incentive to return to the labor force as soon as possible, even at a lower wage rate because they have financial responsibilities. So they said, governments don't have to do anything. Right? The market will sort itself out. People who need a job will go and look and hunt because they ain't got no choice. They got to live. And they will accept a job even if at a lower wage rate. So eventually, all of those people who were laid off will be back working. Even if it's not at their previous position, even if it's at a lower scale, they're back to work. So classical economics said, in the long run, if you leave things alone, in the long run, everybody will get back to working. We will return to full employment in the long run. Right? And this will happen because wages and prices will adjust quickly and freely to changes in demand. Right? Just because you got laid off, you're not going to sit at home for 6 months. Right? As soon as you get laid off, you start hunting around for next check because you know that bill is coming next month. You ain't got time to sit around. Right? And when they're saying wages adjust, if you were making $800 a week, and now because you got laid off, you have to accept a job making $700 a week. In essence, that's a downward shift in your wages. So your particular wage has adjusted downward to meet the fact that demand for your services has changed. And we extend that out to a whole swath of our economy, and we see that wages on the whole would have downshifted because people have to accept a lower wage rate because their previous wages, the job that was paying them their previous wages, is no longer available to them. All right. So classical economics says in the long run, everything's good. In the long run, things will adjust. People will adjust. We'll be back to full employment in the long run because people don't have no choice. Now, on the other hand, Keynesian economists, also known as short-run economists, that we understand that. We know the economics. That ain't our issue. All right. Keynesian economists are saying, they assert that while the economy will return to full employment eventually, we don't doubt that at all. But the fact of the matter is that prices and wages can be sticky, which means that just because you got laid off yesterday, don't mean you're gonna find a job tomorrow. Right? There is this period, this transition, this stickiness. Right? And they're saying because prices and wages can be sticky, there's likely to be some persistent disequilibrium. There's likely to be some ongoing unemployment. Persistent disequilibrium is just economic way of speaking. Persistent ongoing employment. And if that's the case, government has a role to play in helping the market return to equilibrium by addressing unemployment. Okay, so the Keynesian economists are saying, we understand the economics, all right? We're not disagreeing with your economics about what's going to happen in the long run. What we're saying is, in the short run, there is a lot of pain out there, right? There's a lot of people who can't find a job, who have bills and ain't got no money, right? in the short run, because these things may persist for a while, all right, there is room for government to step in and try and ease the pain until these people, in essence, until the economy gets back on its feet. Does that make sense? Ladies and gentlemen, from here until the end of the semester, this is the policy discussion. All right.
Question, Mr. Demers, before you
Yes.
continue.
Oh, 1 second. That's Mackie.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So, I mean, I hear you saying long run and short run. Is there an actual time frame for these figures,
No.
or you just speaking hypothetically?
Okay. No. Okay. Good question. In economics, the short run is the period of time in which at least one factor of production is fixed. All right. Usually that's capital, because think about it this way. We're saying in the short run, let's say one of your factor would you involve in producing, I don't know, let's say you're Chippy Chipman and you produce t-shirts and that kind of stuff. All right. You can always hire more people. All right. So labor is flexible. It is going to take you a lot longer to say acquire more machines, build another building, right? If demand for your product changes. So in the short run, we're saying, let's say you have a huge order come in. Right? You can bring in more people, work them over time, but you're still stuck with the same amount of machines that you've always had. Right? You're still stuck with the same one production floor. So in that case, that capital, that building of machines, that factor of production is fixed in the short run. Now, if you give you enough time, you could always buy more machines, build another factory. But so when we're talking about short run economics, we're talking about a period of time in which at least one factor of production is fixed. Does that help?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And so the long run would be what, multiple, or I guess
The long run is a period of time in which everything can be changed and adjusted to make sure it's at its best. You can hire more people, you can build more factory, you can dig up more coal, you can level a mountain, you know, whatever's not, because the long run is whatever's long run, when all the factory production are able to change.
Okay, that's a bit clearer. All right.
Okay. And I think Ms. Seymour, was that you?
No, it was me. You answered it already. It was the same question.
Okay. All right. So the two schools or branches of economics looking at the same information, and they don't disagree with the economics. All right. They know that, you know, the economy operates in a certain way, and eventually we'll all get back to equilibrium. There's pressures in the market that's always going to push people, even though you got laid off, push you to get back to work. Right? And that applies to every factor in our economy. There's no disagreement there. The disagreement is about what happens in the meantime, in the interim. Right? The Keynesian economists are saying in the interim, there is scope for policy to sort of stimulate the economy, getting us back to equilibrium, and in essence, short circuit that period of time that gets us back to equilibrium. Right. Now, one last thing on this, the background, the Keynesian economics, the short run economics, is named after Dr. John Maynard Keynes, economist who did a lot of his work in the 20s and 30s. Right around the time of the Great Depression, which is not just the United States, it was actually globally, but you understand, you begin to get a feel for his thinking and the people who came after it, what we call either neo-Keynesian and et cetera, et cetera. The idea is that they saw the pain. During the Great Depression, you had as much as a third of the male population in the United States was unemployed. Now understand, this was also a period of time where most women didn't work. So if you have most women not working and a third of men not working, a lot of people were suffering. Right? And a lot of the thinking at the time by Dr. Keynes and others was that Dr. White as well, although Keynes get all the, well, he got the Nobel Prize and all the accolades, was that, is there a role for government, policymakers, in addressing some of these things that we're seeing happening, some of the negative outturns that we're seeing in our economy, some of the dislocations, and some of the unemployment. We are far away from equilibrium. Is there room for policymakers to address this? And this is when we talk about government, we're talking about policymakers. So that was really a background of a lot of this conversation. Okay, that being said, let's begin by talking about what we mean when we talk about the short run. The short run production function, all right, explains the relationship between total inputs and output. Right. In economy, right, we talked about the 5 factors of production, right? But in fact, we could condense those 5 factors of production into 2. We can condense it into labor and capital. And we said, if you look at any economy, you can condense how the factors that go into producing GDP in those economies into some labor component and some capital component. So when you see a short-run production function that says GDP or Y, you often see it written this way because remember when we were talking about the circular flow diagram, and we said the real stuff, output, is on the outer circle and money going in the other direction in the inner circle. And when we were trying to calculate GDP, we said you can use the expenditure approach, which measures the value of inventory, or you can use the income approach, which measures the money that you would have earned from the sale of the goods and services. Well, this is the thing here. GDP is the expenditure approach. The Y stands for the income approach, the money. We don't use I because in economics we use I for investment, so we use Y instead. All right. So all we're saying is that whether you're talking about the expenditure approach or income approach, when you look at any economy, output or GDP is derived from some, F is a function. F just says that there's some relationship between the 2 variables that I have in the brackets. K for capital. We don't use C because we use C for consumption. K for capital and L for labor. So all this production function is saying there is some relationship between capital and labor. Output is derived from some combination. Now, what that combination is, what that functional is, will depend on what factors of production are available in any given economy. So, for example, if you have an economy that has a lot of uneducated workers, right? Whether you're talking about, say, an India or some large African country or some large South American country with lots of people, but not a lot of capital. So in that case, a functional relationship, the L would be very big, K would be very small in percentage terms. Or you can have an economy where you have very relatively little people in it, like the Bahamas, but lots of capital, lots of buildings, resorts, etc. Right? So the relationship there will be different. The F, which says is a function, the F is going to tell you how much in percentage terms of the capital versus how much in percentage terms for the labor. All right, so all we're saying is it assumes that economic output is produced with some combination of capital and labor, depending on the factor of production prevalent in the economy and the type of industry that we're talking about. And here's our definition here. by Mr. Mackey, in macroeconomics, we assume the short run to be that period of time in which at least one factor of production is fixed. In general, we assume that the quantity of plant and machinery is fixed and that production can be altered by changing variable inputs such as labor, raw materials, and energy. Okay. So, Kraska, in the short run, at the very beginning of the class, we talked about the key economic principles. And of course, one of those was the principle of diminishing returns. And the principle of diminishing returns, just to remind ourselves, states that as more units of a variable input are added to a fixed amount of land and capital, the changes in output will rise and then fall. In fact, technically, the principle of diminishing returns says if output is produced with 2 or more inputs, and we increase one input while holding the other fixed, eventually output will begin to increase at a decreasing rate, right? So if you look at our short-run production function again, and we said if our capital is fixed, the amount of plant equipment and machinery is fixed, and we increase the amount of labor, eventually output will begin to increase at a decreasing rate. Okay, so let's go back to our Chippy Chipman example, right? So let's say right now on his factory floor, he has 50 workers and 50 machines, all right? And they work 8 hours a day. Each person has a machine and they produce X amount of output. What happens if he has a big order comes in? What are his options? Anyone?
I would guess his options would be to work them overtime.
Okay,
Because
option 1, right? Instead of working 8 hours, we work overtime. Right. Okay. Is that not an increase in the amount of labor resources available to him? Right.
yeah,
Isn't it?
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. What if that's not enough to complete his order? What other options are available to him?
I mean, he could hire more personnel, but
Okay. So he can also hire more people. So again, his pool of labor is not fixed. When we talk about labor, we're not talking about the person, we're talking about the labor hours that are available to him to get this order out. All right. So 1, he has 8 hours and 50 people of 8 hours, 400 hours worth of labor available to him to get this order out. That's not enough. So now he has contracted to get additional labor hours. Now, of course, he has to pay extra over time for this extra labor hours. And if that's not enough, now he has to hire even more persons. But in each point in time, you can see where he has some flexibility in that he can always go out and get more resources, labor resources, to meet his needs. All right, okay. Now, what are his constraints? Can he hire unlimited number of people, assuming he has the money?
Well, technically, you have so many of the money, technically, yeah, but it's not ideal because he have limited space and machinery. Yeah?
Okay, so let's see. All right, so first of all, I have my 50 people working 8 hours. All right, and let's say I need to add, I will give them another 4-hour overtime. All right, so now they're working 12 hours. And that's probably as far as I can push them. Would you agree? 12 hours straight.
Fair, fair.
Okay, before people start rebelling. Okay, fine. So I hire another 50 people. All right. But I put them on a separate shift. Would that work?
Yeah, that would work because
Oh, okay. Yeah,
you
because
you maximizing the use of your space in the machinery.
so now I have two shifts. I have a day shift, I have a night shift.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
All right, fine. So would you expect my output to go up?
Definitely, if you run in more people and more machinery. I mean, if you run in for a longer time and more people.
So now, according to the principle of diminishing returns, there are two inputs in my production process, right? There is people, and then there are machines. So far, so good?
Yeah. Wait, say again. Sorry, you say.
Okay. I'm producing T-shirts. I'm Chippy Chipman. The two inputs in this production process is machines and people, labor and capital.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now, I have the flexibility to increase the amount of labor I'm hiring. All right. But in the short run, I'm stuck with the same number of machines that I've ever had. Because it's going to take me a while to import new machines, additional machines, right? That might be a month, that might be 6 months, that might be a year. But in any case, none of that's going to help me right now with this order. So here I can hire more people, so I can increase my labor input while holding one input, my machines, my capital input, fixed. Does that describe the scenario we're looking at? Okay.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you.
I hire additional workers, so now I have two shifts going. So my output definitely goes up. Can I hire more workers? I certainly can, because I got the money. But what do I do with these workers? Right. Now, people have to share machines. Mm-hmm. So instead of having a day shift and a night shift, now I have 3 8-hour shifts. Output still goes up. I've increased my input, which is labor. Output, which is T-shirts, continue to go up. Right. All right, fine. I hire more workers now. Now, I have 4 shifts of 6 hours each. Would output still go up? More workers. But now, what about each worker? Instead of each worker working 8 hours, now each worker only works 6 hours. So although total output may go up, the output per worker has gone down. And even if I continue to add more workers, output will continue to go up, but go up at a decreasing rate. And at some point, I'm just not going to have enough machines at any point in time for all the workers I'm hiring. So output not only begins to increase at a decreasing rate, eventually the output will begin to fall. People are getting each other away, rowing over machines, fighting who got here first. Your time is up, it's my time now. Output begins to fall. So the principle of diminishing returns applies here as well. It says that as you increase more units in the production process, and if one of those factors is fixed, output will begin to rise, but eventually it will begin to fall. And it's important for us to remind ourselves about this principle because it's going to become very important when we begin looking at these two capital and labor markets. So before we can begin to make use of the short-run production function, we first need a clear understanding of the capital and labor market. All right, so let's start with the capital market. All right. And if you look at your diagram, Y represents GDP or income, whether we're talking the expenditure approach or the income approach measuring GDP. K is capital. Okay. So K is the stock of capital. That's your machines, equipments, building. And the amount of capital that you have available to work with depends on how much you invested in the past, how much wear and tear has occurred on those stuff that you purchased in the past. That's what we call depreciation. And how much new stuff that you bought. Right. So if you look just below your diagram in gray, KT plus 1 is your capital stock at the beginning of the next period, and it's a combination of what you purchased this period plus what you had initially minus depreciation. If you work for a bank, your bank does this all the time, right? You will see this most dramatically when they're dealing with their IT inventory. Your IT inventory, this is your laptops, your desktop, your printers, or all that kind of stuff. Right. Right. So if your bank's like anything like my bank, you have these people coming around either every quarter or every 6 months, and they inventory all of this stuff. Right. And somewhere in your accounting department, or if you have an audit department or internal audit department, and these things, this is where it takes place. So what they're measuring is saying, okay, what is the total value of our IT equipment in, let's say, beginning of 2023? Right. So it will be everything we purchased or acquired in 2022, everything we had prior to 2022, minus any wear and tear of that stuff we had prior to 2022. Right. That's all we're talking about. Right. Your stock of capital you have at the beginning of any period is what you purchased during the period just prior to that, plus everything you had minus any wear and tear or depreciation. Okay, if that's the case, let's look at how the principle of diminishing returns affect our capital market. If you look on the horizontal axis, on the K-axis, we're assuming for a moment that we are increasing our capital stock by the same amount or a similar amount each period. All right, so you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 looks like they're fairly evenly spaced. All right, and you see, let's say at time period 1. So we purchased this capital stock and we've used it to produce output on the vertical or Y/GDP axis. And you see, even though we're increasing the same amount of capital each year, GDP, our output, goes up by a smaller and smaller amount each year. The principle of diminishing returns. Right. And in fact, this is exactly the case. We would see it very often in the Bahamas in terms of our relationship with the tourism sector. Some of you may be old enough to remember prior to Atlantis, there was Resorts International on Paradise Island. Then Saul Kirshner came in, purchased the property from Merv Griffin, right? Sunk a couple of $1 billion into it, and voila, we have Atlantis. Atlantis then went about hiring an additional 2,000 people. I remember the recruitment drive. They had their people at, this is top of the hill, St. Augustine's. I don't remember the name of the building anymore. Emmaus Center, I think is the name of it. And they had lines stretched out down the hill, all the way into Fox Hill. People looking for a job, Atlantis. Right? The point is that when we look at the economic impact of Atlantis' that first investment, we saw a huge jump in the Bahamas GDP. Right? GDP went up 3, 4, 5% in real terms. That is a huge jump from one investment. But each subsequent year, we find that that investment is yielding less and less increase in overall GDP. Even though the property is the same amount of workers making the same amount of money, contributing the same amount, but yet its impact on the economy is getting less and less each year. Right. Then we have somewhere like Bahama, the exact same thing. First investment, big shot to the arm of the economy, but each subsequent year, getting less and less bang for our buck. And in fact, we have gotten to the point in the Bahamas where there was a time where a $100 million investment, which we consider small nowadays, was huge in terms of moving the needle in terms of our GDP. Now, each time for us to get the same amount of impact on our GDP, we need to have billions of dollars invested at a time. Because each subsequent injection has a smaller and smaller impact on the overall GDP because of the principle of diminishing returns. Right? So when we look at our capital market has this shape. Okay. What about the labor market? Any questions about the capital market before we move on?
Were both of those for the short run, or one was for the long
Yes,
run?
we're only talking short run. This is the short run.
Okay.
All right. Because in the long run, you could always get more investment. More money coming in, more people, more labor. In the short run, you could always build another hotel. All right. Think about this. Okay. Let's say you have, say you have a Bahama. All right. And Bahama can easily hire 8,000 Bahamians. All right. So with 8,000 Bahamians, it is booming. All right. What happens if Bahama doubles its labor force? So that you get 16,000 Bahamians working there. Is it likely that that operation will be going as efficiently as it could? Well, here's where we speculate economically. All right. Think about it this way. Let's say you need a housekeeping force of 200 to efficiently manage the housekeeping responsibilities for Bahama. All right. if 200 is necessary to service the beds, what happens if you hire 400? Inefficiency, wastage, slunking, people getting in each other's way. Clearly, output will be increased because you have more people working, but the amount that each worker can do. If I have 200 workers and each worker can make 20 rooms in the morning, hiring more workers certainly will increase the number of rooms that we can do, but the amount of rooms that each worker can do would go down. So output would increase, but at a decreasing rate. Right? If you need a staff of 350 gardeners to take care of the property, hiring more gardeners will certainly help in terms of taking care of the property, but what it means that each individual gardener will contribute less. Output would increase, but at a decreasing rate. If you need 25 accountants to manage the finances, doubling that amount of accountants will certainly increase the amount of work that you can get done, but the amount of work that each individual accountant does is going to go down. Right? Output would increase, but at a decreasing rate. So here, when we're talking about capital market, we're talking about everything involved in this fixed process. Okay. What about the labor market then? Right? If you assume that in the short run, all right, the amount of hotel rooms that are available to you is fixed. All right? So if you assume in the short run capital is fixed, output or GDP is determined by how much labor is employed in the economy. Right? Output is determined by labor. Right? And we see this back to our hotel sector. When there is a change in the demand for tourism services at a hotel, what happens is that the hotel changes the number of hours that they want from their workers. So then you have people talking about they're working 4-day weeks, 3-day weeks, 5-day weeks. In the good old days, people used to work 12-day weeks, 13-day weeks. But the idea is that output, how much tourism services can be generated, is going to depend on how much labor hours. All right. The amount of labor that will be employed in the economy is determined by two factors: the demand for labor and the supply of labor, and this is negotiated in the labor market. So this is the demand and supply functions that we did a lot in this class, but we're applying it to labor. We're thinking of labor just like any other product or service, right? And we said the law of demand still applies and the law of supply still applies. But here we're focusing on not just any other product, we're focusing on the labor product. So the labor market is just a market for labor, the demand for labor and the supply of labor. Therefore, equilibrium in the labor market will be when the demand for labor is exactly equal to the supply of labor. And equilibrium in the labor market is what we call full employment. Okay, so let's start our conversation by looking at the demand for labor. We'll look at both sides. We'll look at demand and then we look at the supply of labor. All right, so firms hire workers until the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost. This is the marginal principle, why we make sure we got those principles down first. Firms will hire workers until the marginal benefit of hiring an additional worker is exactly equal to the marginal cost of hiring an additional worker. So if I'm a hotel or any kind of company, I will continue to hire people as long as when I hire someone, they make more money for me than what I'm paying them. Right? You made more money for me, I hire you. Okay, now do I hire somebody else? Okay, let's see. What do I have to pay this next person coming in versus how much money this next person is going to generate for me? That is going to determine whether or not I'm going to hire that next person. And I'm going to keep on doing this until the very next person I hire make only just enough money to cover their salary. And that's where I stop. Because it makes no sense for me to hire anybody else, because at that point, the likelihood is that they're going to cost me more than what they're going to make for me. And this is all about marginal benefit and marginal cost, and marginal principle. And we're not looking at our entire labor force here. We're looking at the very next person that we're looking to hire. Right? So first, we'll continue to hire worker after worker until the marginal benefit of hiring an additional worker is exactly equal to the marginal cost of hiring an additional worker. Well, the marginal cost of hiring an additional worker clearly is their wage rate, the real wage rate. That is the purchasing power, not just the nominal amount. Here, we're back to our conversation about the reality principle. So the marginal cost of hiring an additional worker is the real wage rate. A couple of things that I guess would make common sense as soon as we stop and think about it. If we increase the real wage rate, right, if the average wage rate goes up, the quantity of labor demanded is going to go down. Law of demand, as price goes up, because wages is just the price of labor. So if the price of labor goes up, then demand for labor is going to go down. Right? We see this, and in fact, this is one of the key issues for most unions. I like to pick on the hotel union because a lot of this stuff is very transparent because it's out in the open, because it generates so much publicity. Right? But the fact of the matter is that whenever they negotiate for a higher wage rate, average wage rate for their people, the hotels respond by demanding less and less workers, less and less hours. So as the price goes up, demand for labor goes down. That's also why you see there are a lot more people working for $20,000 or $30,000 a year than they are working for $100,000 and $200,000 a year. Right? At these very high wage rate, demand for those persons are very low. But at lower wage rate, demand is much higher. The reverse is also true. Decreases in real wages increases the quantity of labor demanded. The result is we end up with a downward sloping demand curve for labor. We talked at the beginning of this class, we talked about demand curve. We said every demand curve is downward sloping, including in this case, the demand curve for labor, downward sloping. Because at higher wage rate, we want to hire very few people are demanded at those high wage rate, and much more persons are demanded as the wage rate is lower. Right? So we have a regular normal shaped labor demand curve, just like how every demand curve. And again, like every demand curve, it is due to the law of demand. As price goes up, demand falls. As price comes down, demand goes up. Price, in our case, the price of labor is what we call the wage rate. What about the supply, on the other hand? Supply of labor is by workers, us. We supply labor. And the amount of hours that we're going to supply to our employer is going to be due to how much they're willing to pay us. All right. Supply of labor is by workers who consider the effect of real wages on hours worked. Again, this seems to make common sense. If you pay me more, I'm more willing to put in more hours for you. The problem is that increases in real wages has two effects, and these two effects tend to be contradictory. The first is increasing in real wages have two contradictory effects. The first is called a substitution effect. And this is the one that we understand most clearly because it makes more sense for most of us. As real wages rise, workers are willing to supply more hours because of the opportunity cost of not working has increased. Hang on. Understand what opportunity cost. Opportunity cost, we said, according to the principle of opportunity cost, is the next best choice, which we most rather have been doing if we weren't doing what we're doing. Right? So let's apply that to this whole conversation about labor. We're saying, if you're getting paid $20 an hour, right? Now let's make it some good money. Yeah, $20 an hour, 8 hours a day, that's $160 a day. $160 times 5, 5, 6 is 300, 5 is 5. That's approximately $800 a week, or $3,200 a month. So $3,000 a month. All right, good money. So $20 a day, $20 an hour. And let's compare that to somebody who, at best, can make $5 an hour, all right? $4 an hour, $2 an hour. What's the minimum wage in the Bahamas? 100 and something dollars a week, $150 a week, 160. 180, I don't know. I know it's pitiful. Right. But let's say that was you. And you said, you know what? The only kind of job I can get is minimum wage. I could stay home and hustle that. All right. My man could take care of me. Yeah. So you stay home. All right. Now, what if instead, this is somebody who has a degree, all right, and they're staying home, and this person could have been making our $20 an hour or $3,000 a month. What is the opportunity cost of them staying home? The opportunity cost, would they sacrifice, would they give up to stay home, is $3,000 a month. You see, where that's a much bigger opportunity cost than the person who at best is giving up $100 and something a week. So the more money you will give up by staying home is the greater the opportunity cost that you are sacrificing. Right? And as real wages go up, the cost of you staying home is much greater, because that's more money that you are giving up the possibility of making. You notice how, I don't know how your company operates, but I know some companies where, let's say you're on sick leave. And after a certain period of time, I mean, if this is a decent company, you're still getting your full salary while you're on sick leave. But after a certain period of time, whether it's 3 months or 6 months, I think 6 months for most companies, you know, now they're paying you 50% of your salary. And the idea is that it provides additional incentive for you to decide, you know what, that's a sacrifice that's too big for me to make. The opportunity cost for me staying home is too great. I'm going back to work. Now, of course, it might mean you're going back to work too early, but from an economic perspective, the cost of you staying home has gone up considerably because you're losing that money. So the substitution effect says, the more they pay us, the more we're willing to work. Right. Because staying home, costs too much. And that makes sense. So we expect to have an upward sloping labor supply curve. All right. If you look at our diagram, when they're paying us W0, the most we want to supply to the market is L0. But as wages go up from W0 to W1 to W2, we want to supply more and more hours. This is also why when you're working overtime, you want to work over, you expect that your overtime pay is going to be higher than your normal pay. Because people have no incentive to work overtime if you're going to get the same pay that you were working during your 8-hour shift. So listen, if you want me to work overtime, you're going to have to pay me time and a half, double time. All right. Same like if you're being asked to work on a holiday, on a weekend, Christmas. I have a friend, very good friend, who's a nurse. All right. And she has a couple of kids, and they have never celebrated Christmas on the 25th because she always chooses to work on the 25th. If they get what, triple time or some nonsense. Yeah. And listen, kids get their present on the 26th because mommy making money. So the more they're willing to pay us, more hours we're willing to kick in. Substitution effect, upward sloping supply curve. Substitution effect. We're willing to substitute our leisure hours for our work hours as long as the money is right. On the other hand, it is also true empirically, that is, when we've gone out and actually did the survey, talked to people, did the analysis, get the data. So when we talk about empiric, when we say something is empirically, it means that this is not just theoretical. It actually went and double checked with in the real world. Empirically, we have also what we see is called the income effect. As real wages go up, income and wealth also increases, and hence the demand for leisure hours. When you start, hi.
Sorry to interrupt. As we're going along, I just need clarity. When I know that with the charts, I just wanted to find out. These charts these are representation of which, because like in this case, you have two charts here. Or if you go back, for an example, are you saying
this is the labor market? So this is the supply side of the labor market. This is the demand side of the labor market.
Right.
And see the bottom one is, I put the two, you remember how we did with the demand and the supply, we put them on the same diagram?
Right.
This is the same, so the labor market is when we put both the supply and the demand together.
Okay, so what about this top one here? This is...
Right. This is still the supply side. All right, so this is the upward sloping part of the supply curve. So if you look at this is that from L0 to L5, that upward sloping piece that goes from the origin W0, L0, that goes up to W3, L5.
Okay.
All right.
This one here.
So this piece, this what we're looking at here is exact same thing as what we have here. All right. Now we've added this piece on top that we're about to talk about. So what we want to talk about now is this extra piece that we see up here. So what we see here is the supply curve went up and then it sort of banked back on itself. So we have this kinked supply curve where it goes up, goes up, goes up, and then for some reason it starts looking like a demand curve.
Oh, okay.
So what we're saying is that there are two things that we see. All right, we see where the wage rate is going up from W0 all the way up to W5, right? Wages are increasing. So what we're saying is that when we see wages going all the way up to W3, it looks like a normal supply curve upward sloping. But somehow when wages go above W3, the supply curve starts looking like a demand curve. It bends back in on itself. So what we're trying to understand is why that happens. Because wages are only going one direction. Wages are just going up. But somehow we see two effects taking place as wages go up. And the first effect, we see what we expect. Yeah, as they pay us more, we're willing to supply more labor hours. But somehow, beyond a certain point, even though they continue to pay us more, we start cutting back on the number of hours that we're willing to supply to the market. How, why? All right, that's what we're talking about. That's what our notes are going to try and explain. All right, so the first thing we did here, the substitution effect explains this lower piece, why it looks like the way it's supposed to look, and it makes sense to us according to the law of supply. The law of supply says as the price goes up, we're willing to supply, firms are willing to supply more to the market. And since we're the one who supply the labor hours, as wages go up, we're willing to supply more labor hours to the market. Right? That is one effect. The other effect, the income effect, says a different story. The income effect is saying somehow when our real wages go up, income goes up, we start feeling our pocket. All of a sudden now we want to do more with the money that we're making. All of a sudden now, you want to go on a real vacation. You got money now, you want to go see Paris. You want to walk on the Great Wall of China. You want to go to Australia. You want to go back to the motherland because, hey, one, I got the money for it. So why not? All right. And those are the two contradictory effects. It makes sense to us intuitively that if they're willing to pay us more, we should be willing to supply more labor hours. But it also makes sense to us intuitively that once I start feeling my money, all of a sudden now, I won't go to Miami shopping. We don't real Bahamians go Miami shopping anymore. We go Orlando or Tampa or Dallas or Atlanta or New York or DC. Miami too common for us now. But you get the idea. You start making some real money, you want to spend that money. You want to take vacation, you want to go to Hawaii. For heaven's sakes, you want to ski. So how does that actually work? What's the issue here? Right? How is it that it started off looking very normal as income goes up, as wages go up, we start supplying labor hours, but then as our income continue to rise, things change in the opposite direction. Right? The key here is at the level of which this changes. The income effect only becomes prominent beyond a certain income level. So what we're saying is that up to a certain income level, everything proceeds normally. But once you start making above a certain amount of money, it's different. All right. And what we found for the Bahamas is somewhere around $50,000. Yeah. Once your annual salary climbs above $50,000, them offering you overtime don't really mean nothing to you. All right. You would much rather do whatever it is that you want to do with your money. Because above 50,000, most of your bills are probably paid. Bills are not something you're going to worry too much about at that stage. You don't worry about BTC or BLC or BPL or whatever it is. Because that stuff is paid. Right. So making about 50,000, now you're thinking, yeah, I can start living. Right. And that's what we see. All of a sudden now you start committing less and less hours. You know, I'm taking my vacation. I'm taking all of my vacation. All right. I'm leaving here and I'm not looking back. So that's why we see a supply curve that has this peculiar shape. Right? That up to a certain point, it proceeds normally. But once you get above a certain income level, people start wanting to put that money to use. And in the Bahamas, it's somewhere around 50,000. Other countries, it's different, right? But it's right around 50,000 for us. Right. Now, this is, purely an academic exercise because we know the vast majority of people in the Bahamas certainly are making less than 50,000 a year. All right. So most of us are going to be on the lower portion of this supply curve. The normal portion, the regular portion of the supply curve. That's what we're talking about. Most of us are going to be on that side. So we said the income effect only becomes prominent beyond a certain income level. And thus we can assume that in general, the substitution effect dominates and we have a normal looking labor supply curve. So in essence, I do want you to know that this portion of the supply curve, this backwards shape of the supply curve does exist and why it exists. It exists for people who are making good money. But because that's not the vast majority of people, we can pretty much ignore that top portion and only focus on the normal side, the normal piece, the normal shape of our supply curve. And that's what all of our analysis is only going to focus on, using that normal portion of the supply curve. So when you look at the bottom diagram, and you're looking at the labor supply curve for the bottom diagram, that labor supply curve is only the bottom part of the shape. All right. So we're only going to focus our attention on the normal part of the labor supply curve. Any questions? Is that fairly clear? Okay.
I guess we need some like scenario questions, maybe see, because you're explaining a lot, but it's just a lot to take in. Like we're getting the examples, but I guess when we put it into practice, I don't know.
Right. So the way we're going to put that into practice is when we start dealing with policy. So for example, let's start here where we talk about macroeconomic policy. So we need to be able to put our short-term production function and our understanding of capital and labor market together to begin talking about policy options, which is really the fun part of any discussion. It's not the easiest part, but okay. So here, if you look to the right, this is a combination of the capital market. Let's go back so you can see. Here's our capital market shape, right? And here's our labor market at the bottom. And we just put those into two diagrams. All right, we place the two, they stack them on top of each other. We put the capital market on the top, labor market to the bottom. All right, so right. We know any economy, any GDP is derived from a combination of how much labor you have available to work with and how much capital you have available to work with. All right. And so then we need to be able to see both the labor market and the capital market together, because that's going to determine how much GDP or output is being generated in our economy. Right? So if you're saying, listen, the Bahamas has X amount of people and X amount of capital resources available to work with. It's only by putting those two together are we going to be able to determine how much output or GDP is going to be generated in the Bahamas. We can't just look at how many hotel rooms we have. You have to look at how much hotel rooms and how much labor you have to work with, because they go together. You can have a ton of workers, but if there's no capital to work with, then they can be sitting idle. Right? You can have a ton of hotel rooms, but if you don't have nobody to service those hotel rooms, you're just wasting your money. Right? So capital and labor, we have to look at those together to determine how much they're going to contribute to the economy, how they're going to grow GDP, how much they're going to contribute to GDP. All right. So we make use of the production function, and the production function just tells us how much of each that we're using. To make use of the production function, we must be able to view how both the capital markets and the labor market work together to produce macroeconomic output. So everything we've done today is bringing us to the point where we want to look at how the labor market and capital market together allows us to see how much economic output is going to be. Right? So we need to construct appropriate diagrams in such a way to see these twin effects. We can do this best by putting the diagrams one on top of the other rather than side by side. Okay, so let's start with the bottom diagram. All right. L star, W star. If this was any other product, this would be Q star and P star, equilibrium quantity, equilibrium price. But because we deal with labor, this is equilibrium labor and equilibrium wage. But we know at L star, quantity demanded will be equal to quantity supplied. And if labor, this is a quantity of labor demanded, is equal to the quantity of labor supplied. So at L star, if demand for labor is exactly equal to the supply of labor, that must mean that we're at full employment.
Mr. Demerit, you could tell me that again, please.
Okay.
Say that one more time for me, please.
Sure. Full employment is defined this way, where everybody who wants a job and is willing to accept the average wage rate, in our case, this is W star, can find a job. Everybody who is looking for a job and is willing to accept the average wage rate, W star, can find a job. Right. In addition, companies can hire as many people as they need to work for them, as long as they're willing to pay W star. So everybody who wants a job can find a job if they're willing to accept W star. Companies can hire as many people as they want as long as they're willing to pay W star. That is full employment. Demand for labor is exactly equal to supply of labor at the price W star. Right? What if Ms. Musgrove, what if you got it into your head that you deserve much more than W star? Are you likely to get hired?
No. Because I have to be willing to accept
W star.
W star.
But you're not willing to accept W star. You think in your own head and in your heart, W star is too low for you.
Right.
So what we can say then is that you don't want to work. Because if you wanted to work, you can find a job at W star. So when we talk about full employment, we're talking about people who want to work and are willing to accept W star, and company hiring everybody they can hire as long as they're willing to pay W star. On the other hand, if you're a company, all right, are you looking to hire people, but you're not willing to pay W star? You think W star is too high?
Then that mean you ain't looking for people?
Exactly. That's exactly what it means. That's what we're saying. Let's look at labor as we would any other product, right? If you are pricing your item so high that nobody's walking into your store to buy this item, then you're not trying to sell this. You can't be trying to sell this. If everybody's selling you your price too high, and day after day, week after week, month after month, you know, your stuff is just sitting on the shelf, you're already trying to sell that. If it were, you'd be more realistic. You would price it at the market price. And that's exactly what we're talking here, except that we're talking about labor. All right. So when we have L star, when we said labor demand is exactly equal to labor supply, we're saying we are equilibrium when we're looking at W star. That doesn't mean that nobody, that doesn't mean there is no one who isn't working, but those who are not working don't want to work. They don't want to work at W star. And if you have companies complaining that they can't find workers, yes, they can find workers. They're just not willing to pay W star. Okay, fine. So let's assume now that we've gotten to the point where everybody who wants a job and is willing to accept W star has a job. And every company who wants to hire people has hired people if willing to pay W star. Right? So demand is equal to supply, and that gives us L star. Labor demand equal to labor supply. Okay. So now we then take that amount of people and we see how much they can produce given the amount of capital that's available in our economy. Right? And to do that, we take this perpendicular, we call it, we go straight up to see where it touches our capital line. And then we go over to our horizontal axis to see how much output or GDP is produced with that amount of labor and that amount of capital. Okay.
Excuse me, Mr. Demerit.
Yes, ma'am.
So W star represents
The average wage rate.
and L star represents
Equilibrium labor, full employment amount of labor.
so that's the employee is L and the employer is
No,
L.
no. Right.
Okay.
L star is you know, when we remember in the homework you did Q star, right? And a Q star was where quantity demanded is exactly equal to quantity supplied. This is the exact same thing. L star is where quantity of labor is exactly equal to quantity supply of labor. Right. Let's see if it's clear when we try a policy. Okay. All right. So, question for you. What's the role of politicians? What is it that politicians aim to do? Above anything and everything else.
Laws?
No.
We can discuss laws? No?
Way down the list. I help you. Above everything else, politicians want to get reelected.
Let's say be a politician. Got it. Yeah.
If you're going to be, if you can do anything, all right, you gotta get reelected to be effective governing. All right, fine. So if you're a politician, how do you ensure that you get reelected? Legally.
Oh, only because you say that just not okay. Be active, be an active
Campaign?
politician in your constituents.
No.
I don't know, like
What do you mean? You know, the answer is easy. If you make sure people in your constituency are better off, more money. Now, of course, you can, that's the hard way. You can easy way, you wait a couple of weeks before elections, start giving out ham and turkey, and you make them feel like they're better off. But really, if you want to be reelected, you make sure people in your constituency are better off. Because generally speaking, people whose income has gone up, they don't kick out their representative, generally speaking. You want to get reelected, make sure your people are better off. So, which means better off, I mean, make sure there's an increase in their wages, the amount of money that they're taking off. Right. And if you're going to do this for the country as a whole, so if each one of us are focusing on making sure our constituents are better off, it's going to cause the whole economy to improve. Right. So if you are the head of the government, which is usually in the Bahamas the head of the party, that's not always the case in every other country. So you're the head of the government. So this is a government function, not a party function. Right. If you're head of the government, then your focus is to make sure that the people under you act in such a way that cause the economy to grow, the GDP to go up. Right? If all of us are feeling bad about where we are compared to 5 years ago, we're much more likely to vote the same bastards in again. Okay, scratch the word bastards, but you get the idea. All right. So if you are the fiscal authority, the Ministry of Finance, who are the ones who run the money, the government through the fiscal authority knows that if they can grow GDP, they're much more likely to get reelected as a government. So what you want to do as a policy maker, all right, you want to find ways to grow GDP. You grow GDP, you stay in power. So far, so good? Make sense? Here now, we're avoiding all the illegal stuff. We're avoiding the corruption stuff. All right, we're trying to be a good government, whatever good means. All right. So as a good government, we know if we can grow GDP, it's much more likely that we're going to get reelected. So from a policymaker's perspective, so the MP has said this to his junior minister. Junior minister said it to the parliamentary secretary. Parliamentary secretary said it to the permanent secretary, who's the one who's going to actually run the show. All right. So the permanent secretary, who's the highest ranking civil servant in the ministry, everybody else is political appointees. So the permanent secretary is the one who is going to devise and execute policy. Fine. Two ways of growing GDP. And he or she, whoever the permanent secretary is advising the minister. All right. And let's say this in the Ministry of Finance, this person is not a permanent secretary. Their title is the financial secretary, but it's the exact same person, exact same position. The FS and the PS is the exact same position, except in the Ministry of Finance, they call the financial secretary. Okay. Although there was a government at some point, I can't remember which administration, but I can't, who decided that they were going to have both a financial secretary and a permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance, which was complete nonsense, of course. They created a new position just so they could have one of their people. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about. Okay. So your financial secretary, your FS, says, listen, boss, you want to go GDP two ways. You can either increase the labor supply or increase capital stock. All right. Both will cause GDP to go up, cause you get reelected. Now, you are just an MP. All right. You got elected, but let's face it, you ain't no genius. You don't understand what your FS is saying. All right. All you hear is that if GDP goes up, I get reelected. So you want to know more about how that's going to work. So those are the two policy options, and you need him to write a white paper or a blue paper or a pink paper to explain this to you. Okay. So let us write this white paper and to see which of these policy options that you should decide to pursue. So let's start with the first one. What happens if we increase the labor supply? How does that cause GDP to go up? And is it a policy that we should choose? So we're going to start initially and assuming that the economy is in equilibrium. That is, we're going to assume initially in the short run, we assume the economy is in equilibrium with full employment, where L star is equal to labor demand, which is equal to labor supply. And we have a fixed amount of capital stock to work with. So if we're at full employment, the economy is producing on its PPC. If we're at L star, so everybody who wants a job is working, and companies can hire as much as they want as long as everybody agree on this average wage rate. If that's the case, we said the economy is at full employment and we're on the PPC. We're doing as good as we can do. So with this amount of labor, using this amount of capital, we're able to produce Y star. And Y star is called the full employment level of output, because this is the most that we can produce given the amount of people that we have working. So that's where we start off. We start off at full employment. Everybody who wants a job has a job as long as they're willing to accept W star. And these people, using the amount of capital that we have available in our economy, are producing the full employment level of output Y star. So that's our starting position. Now we're saying we want to increase, according to our policy, we want to increase labor supply. Question for you, how can we increase the labor supply, the amount of people working in the economy? We can do it through a number of different ways. Government can increase immigration, right? Whether increase the number of expatriates, increase the number of work permits, legalize some existing illegal immigrants. Yeah, there are possibilities of increasing the supply of labor. So all we're saying is initially, all Bahamians who want a job are working. Right? But we still need more people. Think about this in terms of the construction industry is a real good case for this. Right? There are a number of projects going on such that the supply of labor in the construction industry is fully utilized. Right? Everybody who wants a job and has the skills to work in the construction industry and is willing to accept the average wage rate in the construction industry has a job. Construction companies can hire as many people as they want, as long as they're willing to pay the average wage rate. Right? So everybody is fully employed. Construction companies have all the people that they need. Right? The industry is going well. Now, what happens if some investor is now investing in a new project, a new mega project? What happens? Everybody who is working is already working. The only option is to apply to the government to bring in new workers, to increase the supply of labor. Immigration, even if it's temporary immigration. Expatriate workers, work permits, right? Increasing the supply of labor. Right. So far, everybody with me? Yes, no?
I
Always
know
saying,
we can see how this get in.
all right, all we're saying is that at this stage, we know that if everybody's already working and we need more people, you have to bring people in from somewhere. Right. Now, how will we see that in our diagram? All right. So let's start off, look at the bottom diagram at the labor market. And we start at the supply LS. And if there's an increase in the supply of labor, that causes the labor diagram, the labor supply curve, to shift out and to the right. Right? A shift out and to the right is an indicator that the supply of labor has gone up. All right. Now, in that case, we see we went from L star to L star 1. So we now have a new intersection with the labor demand curve. Right. Our labor supply curve went from LS to LS1. So the total amount of labor available in our economy went from L star to L star 1. Now we take that new amount of labor, L star 1, and go all the way up to our capital curve. And we now see that L star 1 can utilize a little bit more of our capital, and it causes output to go up from Y star to Y star 1. So if you increase the supply of labor, your economy improves. Absolutely every time. Right. If, for example, the government lost its mind tomorrow and legalized every illegal immigrant in this country today, our economy would improve. GDP would go up. Because now you would have more people able to be employed in a lot of other areas of the economy that they weren't able to be employed previously because they were illegal. Okay. So now you have more, let's deal with the Haitians, for example. Haitians in every walk of life, every branch, every job, not just housekeeping and gardening. All right. So the result is going to be an absolute increase in GDP. More people working, producing more stuff, making more money, spending more money, buying more goods and services. GDP will go up absolutely. No argument. People may not like it because of some, up in their feelings about Haitians. But from a purely economic perspective, the economy would definitely go up. Right? And we can see this not on a diagram, but we can see this in reality. And this is not just a theory, this is an actual fact. If you increase the labor supply, regardless of the mechanism, whether it's increase in immigration, increase in number of work permits, increase in number of expatriate workers, legalizing illegal immigrants, whatever the methodology, if you increase the amount of people working in your economy, your output, your GDP is going to go up.
What is the why? Okay.
Why is income, output, money? The amount of money generated in your economy is going to go up. Absolutely.
So you said why is output?
There's two ways. Remember, when we were trying to measure GDP, we said there's the expenditure approach and there's the income approach.
Right.
Just two ways of measuring the same thing. We use Y to indicate the income approach. We don't use I because we use I for investments.
So what's the Y star one?
Right. Y star is, let's go back here. Full employment level of output, see the very bottom of our note? Full employment level of output is what we call in Y star. It's how much the economy is producing, how much GDP or output or income the economy is producing when everybody's working. This is when the economy is on its PPC. This is the income being generated by the economy at that point. All right. But if you add more workers, more money will be generating from the economy. GDP will go up. All right. I could have written GDP/Y here, and it'd be the exact same thing. All right. But this only tells one half of the story. All right, because here's the question. Should the government legalize our illegal immigrant population? Does that say anything about the demand for labor? That certainly increases the supply of labor, but does that say anything about the demand for labor? Is there, this big clamoring for more workers? Listen, we're so short of staff, we need to hire more people. We can't find nobody to work for us. Are we hearing that? No. So nothing about this scenario says that there's an increase in the demand for workers. We know that we see where, from a policy perspective, we decided that we're going to increase the supply of workers. And we see that if we increase the supply, GDP would go up. Absolutely. But we have not considered the demand for workers. All right. So let's go back to our diagram, our labor diagram. So let's look at our new labor supply curve, LS1. And look where it touches our same labor demand curve. And you see, if you look to the horizontal axis, you see the result is the average wage rate falls. Well, why would the average wage rate fall? All right, let's think about this logically. And we're using, let's stick with the same illegal immigrant example. What happens now if your former gardener is now in a position to compete with you for your job at the bank? You don't think he or she'll be willing to accept a slightly lower wage than what you're making now to make sure they get your job?
Yeah, we're just.
Okay. But we can see this happening in every sector of the economy. where now these extra workers are now competing with the existing workforce for jobs. Right? And because they are going to be willing to accept a slightly lower wage rate than the existing job holders, the result is that they're going to push those persons out of work. And now those persons are unemployed, and then they're going to want to continue to work because they're going to need jobs. They're going to do the exact same thing to the people one step above them. Okay. Use your bank as an example. Let's see, what's the lowest person on your bank? Let's say that's the messenger. All right, fine. So now the messenger finds that his job is under threat because this newly legalized Haitian worker is willing to accept slightly less than what the messenger is being paid now. So the bank has every incentive to hire the lower paid worker. So now the messenger is out of a job, but he likes working for the bank. He likes the prestige of saying, I work for the bank. Right? People don't have to know that I'm just driving. So comes the supervisor and says, what can I do? Well, we can offer you a position as a counter person. Now, you know, and it certainly pays better than your messenger. But what about the existing counter person? Well, you know what? I'm willing to accept a little less than what you're paying the existing counter person. So now the messenger is now on the counter, and the counter person has gotten pushed out. Now the counter person thinks, well, yeah, I think I could do the cashier job, and I accept a little less just to make sure I get that job. Now the cashier is out of position, and now they're looking for a job. And you see how the process continues. But in each step, the new person is accepting less than the previous position holder. The result is that on average, the wage rate falls. Because for every position now, the new position holder has accepted a lower wage rate than what was being paid previously. Okay. So the wages of everybody gets pushed down. And that is what we're seeing in this lower diagram. As the supply of labor goes up, all other things being equal, if there's no change in the demand for labor, we see wage rate being bid down. GDP goes up for sure, but the average wage rate in the economy falls. So should we employ this policy, all right, we're going to find out that the average wage rate goes up, sorry, the output goes up, but the average wage rate falls, sorry. And the impact of this is clearly going to affect those persons on the lower end of the scale. Right? Remember, we talked about the messenger, we talked about the counter person, we talked about the cashier, those people at the very end, and those persons tend to be the union people. Right? We won't see this management at the management level because these new immigrants won't really have the capability, the skills, and the education to push out management. So this policy is going to have two effects. GDP is definitely going to go up, average wage rate is going to go down, and it's going to affect the people on the lowest end of the scale most. Unions, union workers. Now, if you were a smart politician, I know that sounds like a contradiction in term, But if you were a smart politician, you would ask your policy person, what's the timeline on this? How long all of this is going to take place? Because remember now, I got an election coming up. Now, an increase in the supply of labor is going to cause GDP to go up almost immediately. All right. Here's the thing, all right. From a political perspective, more people working mean more people making money. More people making money means more people got money in their pockets, more people got money in their pockets, more people spending money, more people feeling good. More people feeling good, they're likely to vote the incumbent to stay in power. All right. So that's what you see immediately. You see more people working, more people making money, GDP goes up, everybody feeling good, we get to stay in power. The decline in the average wage rate takes time. Because remember, we talked about the whole process of moving up the ladder. One person pushing the next person out, pushing the next person out, pushing the next person out. That takes time. And that may take as long as 18 months. So if you were a smart politician, you enable this policy, you get reelected, yeah. And in fact, you tell your unions, listen, look at all these extra people that we're bringing in that could be part of your union, because we're increasing the supply of labor at the lower end. Unions are very happy because they always like when more people working paying union dues. And it's only 18 months after I get reelected that the unions realized they got screwed. Okay, sorry, let me fix the economics. Realize that the average wage rate, particularly for their people, have declined. But then again, you're in power. You got another 5 years to try and persuade them that they was wrong, and let's do it all over again in another 5 years. So the supply of labor, this policy option, if you increase the labor supply, GDP goes up, but average wage rate falls. All right. And this is what our notes are saying. So option one, increase labor supply. I'll go through the notes. So this new level of output is combined with our existing stock of capital to produce higher level of output or GDP. Right? Full employment level of output, this is why star always increases when labor supply increases. Right? When more people are able to work, GDP goes up. However, because there is no indication that demand for labor has gone up as well, the entrance of all of these new workers into the economy, which was already at full employment, means that the equilibrium wage rate will fall as new entrants in the labor market bid down the price of labor. So we see this whenever there's an increase in the supply of labor. We also see this every year when you have another, 8 or 10,000 students graduate from high school looking for a job. All right. We're not talking about the ones who are going off to UB or going off to college. The ones who are looking for work. That is an increase in supply of labor. If and when they find job, output goes up, GDP goes up, income goes up, but the wage rate falls, particularly for those on our lower end. One policy option. Right. So summary, GDP will rise, but real wages will fall eventually. Any questions before we look at our second policy option? Any argument? Any debate? Anything that's not clear?
Are we expected to draw? Once again, I think I would have asked which point in our session we would be able to really get a hold of creating these charts, or is it that we don't
Most
have to?
likely, I will give you the graphs because I'm not interested in testing out your drawing skills. What I'm very keen on making getting a clear idea is that, do you understand what's going on? No. So no, you won't need to draw the graphs.
This one here is a bit more complicated, I must say, than the PPC. I mean, I see where we're going with it, but it's still, why are we using policies in this aspect of the class, as opposed to, I guess, when we were working with graphs, we were using more or less like scenarios. Is it?
Right.
I don't know, I'm just trying to connect.
Remember, we talked about the first half of the class is really laying the foundation of our understanding of macroeconomics. All right, that's our foundation building. Right, the real meat of the class is really policy options and putting that economic understanding to use. Because remember now, macroeconomics is the study of the nation's economy as a whole, because we want to better understand the economic choices being made by individuals, firms, and the government, and how those choices affect the economy. Policy is nothing more than choices. A policy says, I'm going, as a government or individual, I'm going to choose to do this. Right? That's why it's called a policy choice. So in our case here, we're saying, we're looking at a choice because this particular scenario, right, you have a government who is looking to grow the economy, as every government should. Right. So what are the choices that are available to me, given the resources that are available to me, to grow the economy and improve the lives of all Bahamians? Right. That's my goal as a macroeconomist and a policymaker. All right. My choice, the choice with individual firms and the government, what choices they make and how those choices affect the economy. That's all we're doing. So the first half of the semester, everything we did prior to today is sort of establishing an understanding for which we can now make more informed decisions. That's all we're trying to do. And yes, it gets more complicated and it gets more messy. Okay? Because we have strayed away from sort of simple analysis to the more complicated business of policy making. Okay? And I can't actually say it's going to get less complicated. But if we're going to focus on this particular case that we're talking about now, all right, we're going to focus on the fact that this policy, if you add more people to the economy, any economy, GDP is going to go up absolutely positively every time. But real wages are going to fall for the lower end. Right. So whenever you hear politicians of any stripe talking about increasing the size of the labor force, you also have to understand that one of the things that you will understand now is that also going to mean the things that they're not saying. Now, one of the things that they're not saying is that that's going to cause average wage rate to fall, particularly on those on the lower end. For those who probably can least afford their wages to go down. But now you'll be able to, sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Demerit, sorry, excuse me, you mean like when they hired a bunch of 52 weeks program workers and pay them minimum wage?
Exactly. Now, those workers, they feel good, they get more money, right? That's not the problem. The problem isn't hiring, the problem isn't when they were hiring them on this program. The problem came about when they converted those persons into permanent positions. Now, it wasn't a problem for people that they hired, it's the people in the existing positions. Because now you have these people who, in order for me to get to work, that means I'm displacing somebody else. Yeah, and I am making less than the person that I'm displacing. Now the person I displace has to go look for another job someplace else. And the job that they may find may not be paying them what they were earning previously. So what it means that the average wage rate goes down. Goes down. A temporary employment arrangement would have been fine, but when they convert those positions to permanent, sure, it benefits the people that they hired, but it costs the existing people, and it caused the average wage rate overall to go down. So it is you get a short-run benefit of an improvement in the economy, and those people who actually got hired feeling better about themselves, but in the long run, it hurts everybody. Not a good policy. All right, so if we don't increase, remember now we said there's two factors that we're looking at in terms of our economy: capital and labor. And so our two policy options is to increase the amount of labor supply, increase the amount of labor, which is labor supply, or increase the amount of capital. We just talked about increasing the amount of labor or the supply of labor. Going to cause GDP to go up, but it's going to cause wages to fall. Right? What about the capital side? Right? So we start off from the beginning again, same as before. We start off at equilibrium. Right? Full employment. The economy is doing very well. We had full employment level of output. Labor demand is exactly equal to labor supply, but now we want insular policy where we're increasing the amount of capital available to work with. Right? Ignore the diagram for the moment, because this is a scenario that we know. All right. We have not looked at it in the degree that we will in a moment, but we know this scenario. All right. This is just simply foreign direct investment. All right. Increase in capital stock is just building a Bahama. First, we just had Atlantis, now we got Bahama. Right. And then we added Margaritaville. Right. That's all an increase in stock is. All right. We've increased the amount of capital, in this particular case, hotel rooms. We've increased the amount of capital available for our workers. So now you have more Bahamians working in the hotel industry because there's a new hotel opened up. Right. Nothing terribly complicated, but this is something we know very well because we've seen it a lot. All right. But now what we want to do, though, is now trace the economics of that. Right. What happens to labor? What happens to capital? What happens to GDP when you build a new resort, when you increase capital stock? That's all we're trying to do. So I don't want you to get so lost in the economics, because the economics is a detailed explanation for this overarching thing that we are very, very familiar with. We know when a new resort is built, that means there's more job opportunities for Bahamians. We know that. And we know whenever there's a new resort being built, that boosts the economy. We know that intimately because we see it. What we're trying to do now is understand that from an economic perspective, from a macroeconomics perspective. So we are going beyond the sort of general knowledge that any Bahamian has to very specific understanding of which economists are looking at this. So that you're now providing with additional tools to understand what's going on. Okay, so how does this work? All right. So let's say if the government were to enact a policy that increases stock of capital, for example, through foreign direct investment. Okay. So if that's the case, the amount of capital, total amount of capital has now increased. We see this as a shift in the capital curve, that's in our top part of our diagram, from K to K1. Okay. All we see is that there's an increase in the amount of capital that's available to workers from K to K1. Okay. That's the first thing we want to look at. And let's see if we can just separate that. I wish I'd used different colors. But anyway, it is what it is. So let's start out at L star. Right. And you see where initially, here's our labor supply curve, and you see our labor supply curve hasn't changed at all. So we have a labor supply curve, and we have a labor demand curve at LD. So LS, LD, and L star. So we start off there. And we go straight up from L star till we touch the K capital, our initial point. And we see we are generating Y star, that level of income or output in our economy. Full employment level of output. We're good. Now, what happens when there's an increase in capital stock? Same amount of people, we're still at L star, but instead of Y star, we see we go up just above Y star. So our output increased when we increase the amount of capital. Okay, so step one. Right. There's a new hotel being built, all right, or has been built. All right. So now the amount of workers in our economy has an additional hotel that they can work at. All right. So what's the newest hotel? Margaritaville. All right. So Margaritaville is finished and is ready to open. All right. So it needs people. All right. If currently experienced hotel staff are all working, where does Margaritaville get people?
This is where they asked the government if they could bring in people.
Government ain't gonna bring in
No,
foreigners.
you know, well, they ain't bringing foreigners to do what? Work in the hotel?
Change sheets? No.
No, they could bring them for management.
Right. So where is Margaritaville going to get regular people?
They used
From the
to
unemployed or the public, yeah?
No.
Do they use
Those people are unemployed for a
Let
reason.
them work overtime?
What same staff? We got these people working at
Or
Atlantis and
maybe
Bahamas.
some of the other hotel workers, they pay them a higher rating, no?
See.
Yes.
So Margaritaville need more people. The best place to find experienced hotel workers from other hotels. Right. So I raid Atlantis, I raid Bahama. Obviously, I got to pay them a little bit more. Right. What it means is that All right, and we understand this, but what we're trying to do is make sure we sort of, you know, this is speaking proper English. We grew up our entire lives speaking in a certain way. And now once we get to high school or whatever, we're forced to speak proper English. This is what we're talking about. We understand this because we know this, but we haven't had to formalize that understanding, right? But that's exactly what Margaritaville would have to do. They would have to hire away workers from other hotels, right? This means that Margaritaville would have an increase in demand for workers because they need people to work in their hotel. Right? To satisfy that increase in demand for workers, they're going to have to offer them a higher wage rate. Because why would you leave your job to go to do the exact same work for the exact same pay? No, the only reason why you can leave is if they're going to pay you more. So you have an increase in demand for workers, and the only way that demand can be satisfied is by paying them a higher wage rate to get them to work for you. So now you have an increase in the amount of workers working at Margaritaville. But that doesn't mean that now Bahama and Atlantis are understaffed. Now they also have to now find workers to replace those who have gone to Margaritaville. So now they're also demanding, there's an increase in their demand for workers to replace the ones that are gone. Which means that to get those workers also, they need to pay a higher wage rate. Now, let's continue the scenario. So now you have these new people working for Margaritaville. Margaritaville is a brand new, spanking new hotel, and you can still smell the paint. Right. It is expected that these new workers, with all this new up-to-date modern stuff, would you expect them to be more productive than in their previous position? You would. And if they're more productive, that means that they are generating more income for Margaritaville. And when you add that extra to the rest of the economy, that means the whole GDP goes up. Because now Margaritaville is adding to what was existing there before. The economy goes up because of what is being generated by Margaritaville. Economy improves. And this process continues all over again. And at each step of this process, wages go up because demand for these workers go up. And that causes, because we know the law of demand says as demand goes up, wages are going to go up. So we expect wages to go up. Sorry, the law of supply. GDP goes up, wages go up. All right, let's see if we can walk our way through our notes. If the government were to enact a policy that increases the stock of capital through foreign direct investment, for example, we would expect the capital curve to shift up. Using existing full employment level output, in fact, I'm going to change the colors for Wednesday, along with a new level of capital stock, we expect full employment level output to go up. More people are being hired. All right. You have a new hotel needs more people are going to be hired. All right. Margaritaville is first going to hire people away from other hotels. Now, those hotels need to find people to work for them. It may mean them settling for people that they weren't willing to hire previously, but now don't have any choice but to hire them. So now it means that people who were not working now have got a call from the hotel to come in. So now you have additional people working, which means additional people making money, additional people contributing to the output of the economy. So because more output is being generated with the same amount of labor, we can say that labor is more productive. Marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost of labor. Right. When Margaritaville hires workers, right, the marginal principle says that at every person that Margaritaville is going to hire, they're going to make sure that the benefit they get from hiring that worker exceeds the cost of hiring that worker. The cost of hiring that worker is, of course, the wage rate. So even though Margaret is saying, listen, I'm going to pay them more to make sure I get them from Atlantis, still, even though I'm paying them more, I fully expect whatever I'm paying them to be less than the benefit I'm getting from them. Else it doesn't make sense. Right? It doesn't make sense for me to snatch somebody from Atlantis if that person is going to cost me more than what they're going to make for me, more than they're going to generate for me. Right? So even though we're looking to hire people, experienced people away from other hotels, we want to make sure that the marginal benefit of hiring that worker is still greater than the marginal cost of hiring that worker. Right. As long as that's the case, we're going to continue to want to hire more workers. Right? Because marginal benefit now exceeds marginal costs, this will lead to an increase in demand by firms. Firms are willing to hire additional worker because each worker is more productive and they're working with additional capital. That's not right. Right? That's going to cause the demand curve for labor to shift out. Everything that we talked about where they're willing to pay more to get these workers, that in essence is the demand curve shifting out. Right. And this process continues because of full employment, the increase in labor demanded by firms can only be achieved by offering a higher wage rate, leading to an increase in labor supply. We see this as movement along the supply curve. And again, the average wage rate goes up. So bottom line, and in summary, as long as we continue to have foreign direct investment, as long as we continue to have foreign direct investment beyond a certain level, and it's one of the reasons why, regardless of whether you're talking about a PLP, FNM, or whatever government it is, the focus has always been on foreign direct investment, because as long as we have foreign direct investment, that's an increase in capital stock. Right. As long as there's an increase in capital stock, it's going to cause GDP to go up, but also going to cause wages to go up. Because every new hotel or resort, a mom and pop little inn is going to require additional workers. Now, whether you're hiring additional workers away from other hotels, or whether you're hiring these workers straight off the unemployment line, there's an increase in demand for workers because you need people to work, which means you're either paying them more to get them away from their previous employer, or you're paying them when they weren't getting paid before. In either case, these people are making more money. But when you build your new resort, open your new hotel or inn, you expect these people to be more productive because you're giving them better, newer equipment to work with. And if they're more productive, then they're generating more money for you. As long as they're generating more money for you, that is, they're making more for you than what you're paying them, you're willing to continue to hire people. And the whole process continues. As long as you're hiring people, people are making money, people are more productive, GDP goes up, wages go up. But this process can only continue as long as there's an increase in capital stock. And for us in the Bahamas, that increase has had to be higher and higher over the years. Right? It went from a few million to 100 million to a couple of 100 million to $1 billion. Now, really, to get the kind of thing that the impact that we're looking for, you're talking about $2, $3, $4, $5 billion. And that is the struggle for almost every government that we've had in the country, is that how do I continue to bring in foreign direct investment to increase my capital stock, which is going to cause my GDP to go up and my wages to go up. It's a policy that works, but it's a very difficult policy for any government because it's a lot more work. Government can always, when it comes to labor supply, they can always authorize additional workers from outside the country. Expatriates, work permits, those are simple things to approve. For a foreign investment, that's a long and complicated process. And so some governments have done it a lot better than others. I think if you look back over the last, 48, 50 years, the first Ingram administration was particularly good. The last Pinning administration was particularly bad. The first Christie administration was blah, somewhere in the middle. All right. But like I said, this is one of the things we know, but trying to sort of follow it step by step through the economics is a bit more challenging. But you know the basic outline. Foreign investment means increase in hotels, resorts, capital stock. That leads to increased employment, higher wages, increase in GDP. Okay. Questions, conversations, insertions, concerns. What I'll do on Wednesday, we'll walk through this again, give you a chance over the next day or so to sort of absorb some of this, read through it again. If you are going over the video that they post on YouTube, all right. But what you want to focus on is that, can I trace the economics? All right. Beyond my general understanding of how these things work, which I've come across before because you've seen this on a daily basis, but we want to be able to trace the economics. All right. I would more happy to go over it again, go through it on Wednesday, because it is something that is likely to show up possibly on your midterm, absolutely on your final.
Can you send us, if you do have in previous sessions, a few videos that we can perhaps gain more knowledge and experience on?
The Institute records all of the classroom sessions, and they post it to their website.
Excuse me, Mr. Demerit.
Yes, ma'am.
Can these that we're looking at now, right? These diagrams, can they be compared to the very, very first diagrams that we originally done? Like you could do a comparison with that, compare to this, or that will work.
What do you mean, the very first diagrams we did?
Remember when we do the post diagram and they say, oh, where we had, we have used two different topics, or we'll use, say, hospital and school, health and school.
PPC.
The
Yeah,
PPC.
right. Like,
No.
is that basically like the same same thing? Can we compare? No?
The PPC is learning our ABCs. This now, we are constructing sentences and paragraphs and writing stories. Well, this first diagram here, this it really is our PPC in detail. Right. This is saying that we are on the PPC. Our labor market is in equilibrium, and we are using whatever amount of labor is available to us.
So we're at our max with no wastage.
Right. That's where we're starting from. Let me say, okay, if you have a point where you are a government, right, and you are in the fortunate position of how you have low to zero unemployment. That's where you are as a government. All right, that's where we're starting from here. All right, but you know that elections every 5 years. All right, you don't want to just sit on your laurels, because you don't want the opposition to say, this was our economy that you inherit. All right. So you want to be able to say, okay, I want to make sure that I get reelected. And the way I can do that is to grow the economy. GDP goes up. We know that there's a tried and tested way among everything else, regardless of the dirty tricks. If we can grow the economy, Bahamians can see that we're doing something, right? And we believe and we trust in the Bahamians that, they're going to reelect us, or they're going to elect us, reelect us, right? So we have two possibilities that has been presented to us, right? We can increase the amount of people working, which always sounds like a good idea. More jobs, right? And one way of doing that is that increase the amount of the labor supply. Right. Now,
Okay.
we don't have to do anything. Let's say we don't do anything with immigration. We don't do anything with work permits. Right? We don't do anything with expatriates. Right. But we just have a jobs program for kids coming out of high school. All right. We commit to getting jobs for kids coming out of high school. It would amount to the exact same thing. You have an additional 8,000 people entering the workforce. What are they going to do coming out of high school? They're going to be starting at the bottom. Right? And starting at the bottom, they're going to put pressure on those people who are already in those jobs. The result is going to be exactly the same. The kids are going to get jobs, so they're going to be making money. All right. So they're going to feel good because now they're working, because they work. And depending on mommy and daddy quite so much anymore. And because their first job, they can start spending money on things, clothes, shoes, cars, girlfriend, whatever. GDP is going to go up. The people who they displace are also going to need to find jobs somewhere. The result is GDP is going to go up. But eventually the average wage rate is going to come down, because these new high school persons, they're going to have to accept a lower wage rate if they're going to take jobs from the existing job holders. that's the first step. That's the first scenario. That's the first policy. We know this. The
So-
second policy, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so let me see if I get somewhat of a understanding, and then you could just let me know yay or nay. All right,
Mhm.
W star, L star, we're at our max.
Yes,
Correct.
yes,
Okay, so when we got an increase in the GDP is when we put this arrow straight ahead, what gives us the LS, which no, you go back to the one we just had.
that one.
Right. Okay. So that is, so when we get the increase, that's when our LS labor supply goes up. So that's when we put the line through W star and L star.
Well, that's when we should, right, okay, so we this is where we start off, right? All right, so at this point, this is our initial position.
So
Full
we go
employment,
automatically start off with this right here, what I see.
right, right.
So-
This
and
is, go ahead,
And this here is basically telling me that we're at our max,
yes,
right? With labor and wages. Two, the GDP has increased, so therefore.
No. Right now, we're at our max, right? Y star is the best amount of GDP that we can produce, given the amount of people are working.
Okay,
Because the K is the amount of capital that people are working with. So think of it as, say, the number of hotel rooms.
so
Right.
when we have two arches for the K, that means our
There's an
stock
increase in
has
capital.
increased.
Yes.
Okay,
Right. That's when
So-
now you have more hotel rooms.
right.
But if you have the same amount of people and you have a new resort opens, that new resort need to find extra people. Now, that new resort is going to take some people from some of the existing companies. Right? And in that case, then the existing companies have to replace those people, either with people off the unemployment line or from other companies. And however it works, there's going to be an increase in the number of people working.
So when is it increase? Then the new diagram will have LED twice, like two set of lines, or
Well,
no?
actually, that is demonstrating a number of iterations, number of cycles. So the first shift, when we see LD increasing, that's what we mean when we say that Margaritaville is looking to hire more persons. So Margaritaville has an increase in demand for labor. And the LD curve is shifting out because Margaritaville is looking to hire a whole range of workers in the hotel industry. All right, so they're looking to hire workers at every job level because they're starting off from scratch. All right, so that's what we see when we see that LD curve shift out.
So it wouldn't be this one anymore.
Right.
We go on to another diagram, another slide over, and tell me what the next one. I see where we get it. Okay.
All right. So when we go from LD to LD1, this is where Margaritaville initially is demanding additional workers. All right. And the only way Margaritaville can get additional worker is they pay a higher wage rate. So that's where we see wage rate going up.
Okay.
All right. So now that they have the extra workers, they have these workers now working on their new premises. We expect those workers to be productive because they got newer, better stuff to work with. All right. And besides, Margaritaville is only going to hire these new workers if, in fact, the benefit of hiring these new workers is greater than the cost of hiring these new workers.
And that's how come our K becomes a K1, because the capital now increase. No?
Now, the capital increases first. All right.
Okay,
The increase in capital is Margaritaville being built. Because you now have additional hotel rooms that you didn't have before. Or a new resort. We had 2 mega resorts. We had Atlantis and Bahama. Now we have 3. All right. So the increase in capital is just a reflection of the fact that we now have a new mega resort being built.
so, sorry, so LD1 is Marguerite. That's supposed to be LD2. That's when Atlantis, those now need opening. They have,
Need to replace the workers that Margaritaville took.
okay,
All right,
so
so
that's
now
how I
they
get
need
the
to-
second line, okay.
and this process continues. You know, everybody needs additional workers. More workers means more money for each worker, and each worker becomes more productive, etc. What I will do tomorrow, I mean Wednesday, right? I'll try and see what I will break the diagrams down so you can see step by step how each curve changes.
So,
Right.
sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, but
Mhm.
let me see if I get this now. If you had a question that says, I have 4 different hotels and it's basically a trickle effect. So I'll have, because we originally start off with LD, right? So
Mhm.
extra hotel will be LD1, and another one will be LD2, and so on until we book out. That's when we could start putting in those extra lines, when we get additional hotel looking for stuff or a different company looking for employment.
No.
No?
This is not additional hotels. Okay. All right, let's see.
I mean, with the labor force, like how we
I-
use the hotel
no.
as an example for labor.
Right, but understand that we're talking about the entire economy. All right. What we're saying is, okay, let's say you have a new hotel open, Margaritaville, right?
Right,
That is the initial impetus. That is the increase in capital stock. All right.
right.
That's step 1.
Okay,
Okay.
K, that's K to K1.
Right. Now you have the same labor force as before. All right. But now you have some people who work at other hotels and some people who were unemployed. Right. But now there's an increase in demand for workers by Margaritaville. So step 1, increase in capital stock. Step 2, Margaritaville needs to hire workers, an increase in demand for workers. All right. So the first things happen, increase in capital stock, and now Margaritaville has an increase in demand for labor, for workers. That's going to cause the wage rate to go up, because the only way that Margaritaville can satisfy its demand for workers is by hiring them away from other companies or hiring people who previously were not working. You get that part?
Right, so that will give us LD or
That will-
LD1.
Right, that will give us from LD to LD1.
Okay,
All right, so now you have these additional workers and now working with Margaritaville, a brand new building, brand new equipment, etc. Not just that, and most importantly now, Margaritaville, although it's demanding workers, is only going to hire those workers if the benefit of hiring those workers exceeds the cost of hiring those workers. And they're going to do this one worker at a time. Right? Each new worker it's going to hire, they're going to make sure that I get more out of this worker than what it's costing me. That's going to be the determining factor whether they continue to hire worker after worker after worker. Because remember that each time they look at a hire worker, it's costing them more than what the worker was getting from their previous employer. Right. So Margarita Will is going to make sure that every time I hire a worker, I'm getting more out of that worker than what it's costing me. And I'm continuing to do that until the last worker I hire exactly covers their salary. Okay. So now that Margarita Will has this bunch of new workers, what about the other companies that Margaritaville hired workers away from? All right. There's going to be an increase in demand by those companies for workers. That's where we see this shift from L1 to L2. L2 to L3.
All right.
All right.
Yeah, because I realize now once you see is an increase in LD, like you say, wages, they offer more wages. So that's why it automatically goes up.
Right. Right. So at the end of the day, we have GDP going up and wages going up.
Right.
But if you look at the capital market, because the principal diminishing returns, you see, okay, look at the labor market. This is the bottom diagram. Even though labor is going up by relatively the same amount each time from L star, look at the impact on GDP. GDP is going up by a smaller and smaller amount.
Right, they're getting smaller. Okay, yeah.
So what it means that even though the number of workers is increasing, GDP is going up by a smaller and smaller amount. So which means that eventually the impact of this new resort on the economy is diminishing. And then we need a new capital, increase in capital, a new resort, right, to start the process all over again. And what we're saying from a policy perspective is that from any government, it means that, you know, you have 5 years as a government. You need to come up with at least $1, $2, or $3 billion foreign investment project every 5 years, at least one. If you're going to keep the economy going in direction you want it to go, and you know, hopefully guarantee yourself being reelected. I know that's a lot for one evening. I have 8:45. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we should pause it there for the evening, and we will take a good stab at this again on Wednesday. I think this is probably the last topic, if I recall correctly, before your midterm. So I want to make sure I go over this on Wednesday, and then leave some time to talk about your exam the following Monday. All right?
Okay. Yes, sir.
All right, folks. Have a good evening, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Good evening, everyone.